Longevity Junky. It's time to get your fix. I'm Nikki Lee.
I'm Buck Joffrey.
And coming up today, we talk with cognitive neuroscientist and boredom expert, Professor James Danckert. And we have some possibly concerning news to share with you, and I'm really sorry about this.
Possibly concerning news. That sounds a little scary.
It's actually kind of sad for me.
Wait, are you talking about our little catch-up thing? Are you talking about...
No. Our catch-up, I think, should be positive. I don't know. What have you been up to? Hopefully something positive.
So what have you been up to?
Well, I went skiing last weekend in Schweitzer, which was epic because
Where's that?
Schweitzer is right across the Washington border into Idaho. Yeah, I think so.
How do you even get there?
Well, I flew into Spokane and then I drove hours.
Jeez.
To Schweitzer.
Yeah. Was it worth it?
Yeah, because there's this northwest storm that keeps hitting. And so I'm kind of following the storm as I do in ski winter season. So I'm doing...
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. You're like sort of a storm chaser?
Yeah.
On skis.
Yeah. During the winter, I am definitely a storm chaser. So this weekend, well, actually tomorrow morning, I leave to go to Jackson Hole. And I'm going to go ski there.
How many times did you ski this year?
Not as many as I did last year or 4 seasons before that, like all 4 seasons before. I haven't been very much because I started late, like very late, like sadly late at the end of February. And that's really bad. And so I'm kind of trying to make up for lost time. So I'm just like literally I'm grabbing Cody in the morning and we're flying there, just me and him. It's a solo trip and I'm just going to go ski.
That sounds fun.
It is fun. It keeps me from being bored.
Yeah, which is maybe something I need to work on a little bit, and we'll learn a little bit about that later in the show.
For sure. I mean, I just like to do things that are like really active, but seriously, the thing for me skiing, not only am I active, but God, it's this feeling with all these mountains, like huge, gigantic mountains all around me. It just makes me feel like my problems are not very big.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very beautiful thing. So
I kind of get that with the ocean a little bit.
Yeah.
I have a little bit of more of the, the grand nature taking over sort of, and just realizing as you're kind of small in the space.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I totally get that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah, and then just going fast down a mountain and just like being in flow, right? Flow is such a great place to be.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
So what we got going on today? What are we doing next? We got the boredom show, but you had some kind of a crazy class action suit, something like that you want to talk about?
Yes, I'm kind of freaking out about this because...
Yeah.
Okay, so recently a class action lawsuit was filed against the Girl Scouts of the USA, which I used to be a part of.
I mean, you're getting sued?
No. Yes, me and my cute little Girl Scout outfit are getting sued. No, but okay, listen. So this lawsuit is claiming that their cookies contain dangerous levels of heavy metals and glyphosate, which I'm really super sad to hear because I swear every time there's a Girl Scout like going to a door outside a grocery store, my dad and I are known to like buy a ton of cookies. So I didn't know that me being a longevity passion driver, I was actually killing people at the same time. I'm just kidding.
Maybe not to that degree.
No, but oh my gosh. Okay, but the lawsuit was triggered by a study from Moms Across America and GMO Science, which tested 25 cookie samples from California, Iowa, and Louisiana. And the study found all samples contained aluminum, arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, and glyphosate. Thin Mints, which are my favorite, Thin Mints reportedly had the highest glyphosate levels, while peanut butter patties had the highest concentrates of certain metals. How depressing is this?
Because my favorite are the ones with the coconut. What are they called?
Oh, are those the tagalong?
I don't know.
Is it coconut and caramel? Like there's coconut on top? Yeah. I don't know which ones those.
You know what those were not mentioned, so I'm not worried about this class action suit.
So you're fine. But everyone looks forward to Girl Scout cookie season. Are you kidding me? They're so delicious. So to see that they're, like, not just kind of bad for you in the sense of, like, sugar and their cookies, but, like, they actually have these heavy metals.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing is, like, I'd like to know more about the suit because the thing is that, like, it sounds scary. These kinds of things in very low levels are, like, kinda everywhere. So I'm curious if there is higher than normal levels, or if this is not to say it's okay, I'm just saying, like, I'm just curious if this is, like, lawyers kind of doing their thing, or if this is particularly, egregious compared to other stuff, right?
Okay, but okay.
Um
But here's the thing. I feel like you're saying, "Oh, just little bits," but everything is having these heavy metals
Oh,
and,
I
like,
know.
mold and things like that. So, if we just do little here, little there with all these things
Well, I'm just
consistently.
saying that there's naturally occurring levels of heavy
Mm,
metals and everything too. Even in water, if you go to, like, spring water, there's going to be
yeah,
some levels of these things. I'm not saying that, hey, it's not a big deal, but on the other hand, I'm just trying to figure out if there's, the lawyers are potentially sensationalizing this in terms of the but I mean, clearly there are some harmful things in here. I mean, like
for sure.
glyphosate's in particular. Yesterday, that RFK Jr. is trying to get glyphosate's banned.
Great, good.
Basically, they're
They're a cancer risk, aren't they?
yeah, cancer risk. Lymphomas. They can disrupt the microbiome in the stomach. All the bacteria in there. They can have effects in the kidneys and the liver. Yeah, so I mean, there is. You know, Again, most studies suggest, like I said before, that, having really low levels in the food are not really likely to cause harm. But, we don't really know what all these long-term effects of all these cumulative things are. And, if we don't have to have them, why do we have them? I guess that's the issue with glyphosates in particular.
Yeah, but okay, so I've taken, like, these oh, well, hell, when we were in, Colombia and we got those, epigenetics tests, right?
Yeah.
It would
Yeah.
show so I've had a couple of those the past, like, couple of years, I'd say, more than a couple in the past couple of years, and I've always talked to the doctors, and they were saying that more and more cases of finding molds and heavy metals they've seen more of that recently than ever. And it's probably because of things like this, where they have, you find all these chemicals like arsenic and aluminum and lead and mercury. Like you find all these in all sorts of things, like you were saying, not just maybe even foods, but it's just really sad that something that's supposed to be, little Girl Scouts, wholesome and and yummy
Yeah.
is, something that is can be hurtful to our body or our brain or have toxicity or even our nervous system over time. Like even like
Yeah.
with aluminum, it can impair the nervous system and bone health over time. So, I mean, I don't know. It just kind of makes me really sad.
No, for sure. I get it. I mean, out of those things, when you think about mercury, it's kind of an environmental thing. I mean, you can get it from,
Fish?
anything from coal burning,
Mm.
incineration, stuff like that. But, I keep coming back to glyphosate because glyphosate it's an herbicide, right? Like, so it's used as a broad spectrum herbicide. It's not naturally occurring. So that's something that you could eliminate from there, right? It basically is for weed management
Huh.
and, it reduces soil erosion and that kind of thing. So, they can do without that. Now, when you talk about some of the other things in there, like aluminum, again, aluminum, it's in the Earth's crust. So that's again one of those things in low levels. It might not be that unusual. Arsenic is often found in contaminated water and soil. But again, cadmium, for example, that's another one. It's naturally occurring, anyway, bottom line is, I think the thing that what we want to understand about these things is, like, is there something that in these cookies that's more than normal, or
Well,
levels,
well, the
or what?
Girl Scouts did respond by assuring that assuring to the consumers that their cookies meet the FDA and food safety standards. They noted that trace amounts of these substances are common in many foods, like you're saying, due to environmental factors. And then food safety experts also questioned the study's methodology, citing that it's a small sample size and lacked peer review. So I guess there's like kind of hope there, but
Yeah.
still, I'm just saying, like, it's really there are some things that can be avoided, in my opinion, and
Sure.
just have better, FDA standards and food standards, in my opinion, from after hearing a lot of what, like, RFK Jr. and just a lot of things that are being
Yeah.
exposed to the public, like, they don't feel very high standard. Like, they're nowhere near the high standards of, like,
Yeah.
Australia or even, like, Europe and things like
Yeah.
that. So, I'm thinking, like, we
Well,
can
I think
step
things are
that
gonna
up
change.
too.
I think things are
I
gonna
know.
change for the better, and in fact,
I agree.
to put a positive spin on this, I pretty much guarantee you, like, whatever's in those cookies, that is not something that's new. That's probably something that's been there for a couple decades at least, and more than anything, what we're doing these days is we're actually aware of this stuff, and we're looking for it. Nobody was looking for this stuff,
Mm, mhm,
20 years ago. I
mhm.
mean, there was it was probably there was probably all sorts of crap in this stuff, and no one had any clue. The big difference is now we're all sort of thinking about health and longevity
Mhm.
and, what can we do about our food, and we're gonna do something about it. So I think things are gonna change a lot over the course of the next few years.
Well, and as we know, it's better for our longevity and our health to just eat whole foods that are natural from the earth anyway. So if we just changed our diet and not had a bunch of cookies all the time,
Well,
then maybe
that's a
it'd be
good
better
point.
too.
I mean, we didn't even hit the whole issue with, like, Girl Scout cookies are, about as ultra
I
processed
know,
as you
it's all
can. It's
processed
like
food, exactly,
but
that's what I was thinking, I was like, "You know what, if
yeah.
we just" yeah, like, we can't even go to that, but
But if you're bored and you got some cookies in front of you, you're
well, I know
anyway.
someone who can definitely help with, understanding if you're bored.
Yeah.
Alright, well, we're gonna take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll talk to cognitive neuroscientist James Danckert, an authority on the science of boredom. Welcome back, Longevity Junkie. It's time for our guest interview. It's the breakdown with Professor James Danckert. Professor James Danckert is a cognitive neuroscientist at the University of Waterloo, specializing in how the brain supports complex human behaviors like decision making, emotion, and attention. His research spans topics such as stroke recovery, mental imagery, and most notably, boredom. He's co authored Out of My Skull, a book exploring the science of boredom and aims to understand how boredom impacts our actions and well being. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Okay, so I feel like we all have experienced boredom. Like, I feel we all know, or we all probably could be like, yeah, I know what boredom is. But can you define it so that maybe we have in this episode a synergistic one description and definition?
Sure. The quote I love to turn to when people want a definition of boredom comes from Leo Tolstoy from Anna Karenina, where he describes ennui as the desire for desires. And this is the thing about boredom. When we're
Mm.
bored, we want to be doing something that matters to us, but we just don't want the options available to us. So the simplest possible definition is that boredom is that state of wanting, but failing to engage well with the world around you.
Wow, that's interesting. I am curious, Dr. Dankert, in terms of I used to be in the neurospace myself, more as a surgeon cutting on things, that kind of thing. But when I think about the idea of boredom, I wonder to myself, why in the world have we evolved this kind of, neural mechanism? Like, what is the neural mechanism, first of all? Like, what are the mechanisms that get triggered with boredom, and why in the world would we have evolved those?
Yeah, so to take the first part, we still need to do a lot more work using things like functional brain imaging to truly understand what that neural signature is of boredom. At the moment, what we can say is that boredom is best represented in the brain as a disengaged attentional state. So you're failing to focus your attention and your cognitive abilities on the task at hand. That can show up as activation in a network known as the default mode network, which is typically what we'd call an off-task network of brain areas that activate together. When we say off-task, that is because The default mode is activated when you're not focused on something external to you. It might be activated when you're mind wandering, when you engage in things like nostalgic reverie, but it's certainly not activated when you're actually focused and performing a task well. So that's the best that we can do at the moment.
Is it related anywhere near the centers of attention? Like, for example, attention deficit disorder. I'm wondering if there's anything related to, I mean, I would think ADD people generally are not bored because they're,
Right.
kind of
High
all over
strung.
the place. Yeah, they're kind of
Yeah,
like,
it's actually
fidgety.
that's actually
Right.
not the case though. So we find, and others find quite consistently, people with ADHD are highly boredom prone. So there's a fairly strong correlation there. And if you split it into the symptoms of hyperactivity or inattention, they're both symptom profiles are correlated highly with boredom proneness. There was an interesting study a while back that took children with ADHD and measured their boredom on and off their medications. And so when you took them off medications, their boredom went through the roof. And when you put it back on, the boredom reduced. And so it's a
You
prominent
do
symptom of
keep
ADD.
talking about measuring boredom, though, and I'm wondering, how are you measuring boredom, right? Like, because you can't, we're not like triggering something in a PET scan or something like that.
Mhm.
You said we don't know exactly where those centers are. So how are we measuring like the amount of boredom we?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
good
I can tell
question.
you when I'm bored, but how do you quantify that?
Well, it's actually really quite simple, although there's problems with it, but you just ask people. I mean, one of the things, if you want to know about somebody's particular state, you want to know how happy someone is, you want to know how angry they are, you want to know how bored they are, ask them.
So you're saying, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how bored are you? And I'm like, I'm really, really, really bored.
That's exactly right. And so if I want to know your state right now, I
Sounds
say on a scale of
scientific.
Yeah. No, I say on a scale of 1 to 7, how bored are you now? And then if I want to know whether or not you're a person who has the trait disposition to experience boredom a lot, so with someone we'd call boredom prone, there's a more extensive set of questions that we would ask you.
Now, if I can't, I don't find myself bored, at all. I feel there's too many things that I can be
Mhm.
doing, or just, I don't know. I just don't experience boredom. So I say, I could be completely wrong if you were to, I don't know, do a brain imaging and I match a brain that's bored. But is it the same? I find myself not being able to really take action as much. Like, I'm like, God, there's so many things that I want to do. And I kind of get overwhelmed with it. Is there any correlation with boredom and maybe false to start?
There's certainly, we characterize boredom proneness, so that individual trait, as a sort of failure to launch. And they just don't get into actions. They don't get started very well. And that's despite the fact that they have the same opportunities that you and I do. But what you're talking about there is kind of choice paralysis. And we don't know
Mm.
that yet, whether or not people who are boredom prone suffer that kind of choice paralysis. You
All
go
right,
to a
we'll get on
restaurant.
that, please. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, next week, I'll call me again. I'll tell you what we
Fabulous.
found.
Fabulous. If you need
Um,
somebody to study, you got your
yeah.
girl.
But if I go back to the other thing, Nikki, you say that you're not bored very often. I think that makes me think of this thing that people say a lot, where only boring people get bored. So you could at least say, I don't get bored a lot,
Yeah.
so you're not boring. But
Mm.
but I think that that's not quite true. What that saying says to me is that people who don't get bored a lot are just really good at responding to it. So I would suggest you do feel boredom, but you
Mhm.
feel it in a very fleeting way, and
Mhm.
because you respond to it so quickly and so well, it feels like you don't get boredom. And that bring me back to what Buck was saying. So why would the brain have evolved this mechanism? And you do see boredom in other species. It's evident in lots of different animals, and there's some great animal studies of boredom that I can talk about if you like. But
Yeah,
why
please.
would we
Sure.
evolve? We'd evolve that because boredom signals the need to explore your environment for something better. And that's a really
Mhm.
good signal to cultivate, right? So you don't want to get stuck in a rut where you do only one thing forever and always. Boredom is one way to help you get out of that rut. Yeah, so the animal studies, if you're interested, one was with mink, and Georgia Mason and Rebecca Meager put these mink in two groups of mink in two different kinds of cages.
Mm.
One was a cage that had nothing for the animal to do, and that's going to be making the animal bored, supposedly. And the other cage is a cage that has lots of toys that the mink can play with. And what they did at the end of the 2 weeks of these animals being in these different housing arrangements is that they then presented them with different kinds of stimuli that would normally evoke very predictable responses.
Mhm.
So they'd show the mink something that they would normally avoid. In this
Mm.
instance, something like the silhouette of a predator. they'd show them something that the mink would normally approach. So it turns out that for mink, a toothbrush is kind of like a laser pointer for a cat. They just go crazy for toothbrushes. So they would normally,
Interesting.
yeah, it's kind of weird, right? And then they show them something the animal wouldn't normally care about, wouldn't avoid or approach. So something like a water bottle. The logic was that if the animals in the cages with nothing to do were depressed, they'd show less interest in the toothbrush. So even things that they normally liked, they wouldn't like so much anymore. If the animals in the cages with nothing to do were apathetic, they wouldn't approach anything. They'd be like the couch potato. But if they were bored, they'd approach things indiscriminately, even the stuff they normally wouldn't care about or would normally avoid. And that's what their results showed, which was really fascinating. And then there's another one with mice, where again, they sort of put mice in a room with nothing or a room with lots of things for the mice to play with. And in both rooms, there's a hole in one wall. And the mouse, they're curious little creatures. They'll poke their nose through that hole. But when they do, they get a puff of air to the nose. And mice hate that. Feels terrible. So it turns out that the mice that were in a room with nothing else to do would poke their nose through that hole to get that aversive stimulus far more than the animals in the other room. So when there's nothing else to do, it's as though the animal gets bored and will even do something that doesn't feel good. So that's the kind of evidence that we have that even in other species that there's boredom.
It's like bored
That
eating.
they'll just put themselves through pain to feel something.
Well, that study's actually kind of launched off from one that was done in humans with Timothy Wilson's group. I don't know if you've heard about, but
is it the one
Yeah.
where they just keep shocking themselves over and
Yeah,
over?
Oh, yeah.
So
Why don't you talk
Yeah.
about that? Talk about that. That's
Well,
a
so
good
they
one.
put people in a room for 15 minutes with nothing but their thoughts. So no cell phones, nothing to look at in the room, nothing to do. And it's worth noting that about a third of their participants quite liked that. And they probably liked it because they liked the downtime, something like that. 1/3 was ambivalent and another third hated it. They were bored and really didn't like it. But the experiment that got them notoriety, I guess, was the one where they put people in a room with nothing but their thoughts, or you could self-administer a shock. And before the whole 15 minutes starts, people experienced the shock, so they knew what it felt like.
And it definitely wasn't pleasant. Like,
No.
Okay, yeah.
No, I mean, I don't know. Can you think
I
of
don't know.
electric shocks that are pleasant? I mean, maybe that's a
people-
whole different show you want to do.
People
but
are weird, you
Yeah,
know?
people
Some
people
might
are
like
weird.
it.
People are weird, I'll grant you that. But so they'd experienced the shock, they knew what it would feel like, and they'd said that they would pay money not to experience it again. And yet, many of them, not all of them, but many of them would administer the shocks anyway. And one guy administered 196 electric shocks in 15 minutes. I mean, that goes well beyond curiosity, right? But it sort of
That is
suggests,
so
like the
weird.
mice, when you're in a room with nothing to do, some of us will even engage in self-harming behavior just to feel and do something.
Yeah.
Wow.
Interesting. So, yeah. So do you see, I'm curious if you see like boredom more prevalent in like people with chemical dependency and issues like that. Like I eat out of boredom.
I eat out of boredom too.
Yeah. But like, it could be a lot more harmful, right? You can drink out
Totally.
of harmful. You could smoke crack out of boredom,
Yeah.
Well,
So
yeah,
do you,
I feel like more drug addiction comes out of boredom, I think, than anything.
I don't know.
Yeah,
That's what I'm
so
wondering.
a lot of that sort of started from anecdotal kind of things that people say, why are you taking drugs of various sorts of kinds? And they say, well, I'm just bored. And so I try to do that. And I think that that's probably true of mind-altering drugs, things that change your conscious experience, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I'll go back to eating first, that there's plenty of data to suggest that people eat out of boredom. So Andrew Moynihan and his colleagues in Ireland have done a lot of this work showing that. And they did an interesting study where they gave people options of what to eat. So they made you bored in various sorts of ways, and then they'd give you a plate full of vegetables and a plate full of M&Ms. And when you're bored, you go to the M&Ms. So it's not just that you eat out of boredom, but that you eat poorly. You make bad choices when you're
But I
bored.
feel like even if you weren't bored, you're going to go for the M&Ms. Most people.
Well, it's the thing
Way
that
more
like is
satisfying.
gonna, yeah, it's a thing that's gonna promote the like biggest dopamine response, right? Like a lot of this to me sounds like dopaminergic stuff. What do you think, James? Is there relation? Maybe just explain what I'm talking about, but to me, a lot of it seems a desire for dopamine.
Well, certainly, I mean, in the study I just mentioned to you, they did have a control condition where people were more likely to choose the healthy snacks than the unhealthy snacks. So it's not just that you choose M&Ms every single time. I guess the notion of the dopamine hit is an interesting one that, we've often thought that people who are bored or boredom prone might be seeking sensations. And I don't mean sensation seeking. They're seeking some stimulus, some stimulation is maybe better than sensation. There's not great evidence for that there is a little bit of work that suggests that there's a correlation there, but certainly they're not thrill seekers. They do tend to have higher risk-taking behaviors, and some of that is associated with drugs and alcohol. So we know that people who are boredom prone tend to have problems with drugs and alcohol and things like problem gambling. But whether or not that's driven by the need for a higher level of dopamine, we'd need more research on that. It's certainly a plausible hypothesis, though.
Well, okay, so we're talking a lot about boredom and what we do during boredom, but is boredom bad for us or can it be beneficial?
Yeah, so there's a distinction that's important to make here between boredom that you might feel in the moment, like right now I'm bored, and being prone to boredom. So the people who are prone to boredom and experience it a lot, there's typically not much that's good that's associated with that. But in the moment, if you're feeling bored right now, it's neither good nor bad. You make it good or bad by virtue of how you respond to it, by virtue of what you do. People really, really, really want to believe in this association between boredom and creativity, that somehow boredom will make you creative. The logic of that is all screwed up, and I can talk about that if you want me to. But if you are a creative person, that's an outlet you can turn to when bored, which is fantastic. I mean, I do it myself. Not that I'm fantastically creative or anything, but I'll turn to my guitar when I'm bored, and it works about 80% of the time. So positive outlets, like creative outlets, people often also will resort to physical activity. Go for a run when you're bored. Those positive things, those are great responses to boredom. But boredom doesn't do the hard work of telling you what you should do. It just tells you should do something. So it's neither good nor bad.
So, okay, but you're saying that boredom is kind of what you make it. So is there a way for our listeners to have a takeaway where they can make it beneficial, or how to take a next step to make sure that it's more productive or something in the positive category rather than the negative?
Yeah, I mean, we don't have good data on this, so we haven't done what you'd call intervention studies, where we sort of try and develop strategies for people and see whether or not they work. So we don't really have
Mm.
that. But I'm happy to sort of spout an opinion, and your listeners
Sure.
can do with it what they will.
Sure.
One of the key things about being bored in the moment is that it's typically associated with a sense of restlessness and agitation, because you want to be doing something, you just don't know what that is.
Hmm.
But if you sort of succumb to those feelings of restlessness and agitation, you're going to make it harder for yourself to make good decisions. So the very first thing to do when you're bored is to just take a deep breath. It's just boredom. It's not going to kill you. And if you just approach it a little bit more calmly, you're probably better placed to find a good way out of it. And then the second and third things to do are very similar, but the second thing to do is to evaluate, well, why am I bored? Because you might find a way then to reframe what's happening. And the example here comes from sort of assembly line work. Most of us imagine that assembly line work is just thoroughly boring. But it turns out a lot of people don't get bored when they do it. And in part, that's because they can frame that monotonous, repetitive work in other ways that make it not boring. So you could frame it as a personal challenge.
Mm.
In the last hour of work, I made 8 widgets. Let's see if I can make 10 in the next hour. And now, because it's a challenge, it's meaningful to you and it's not boring, right? You could do that with any situation that makes you boring. Just think about, well, why? What is it that's boring about this? And can I rethink it? Can I cast it in a different way? And the third thing is to think about what boredom is really pushing you to do, which is to say, what are my goals, big and small? What are the things that matter to me? And am I pursuing those things effectively or not? You might not be able to launch into some action that addresses that right in that moment, but we don't often give ourselves much of a chance to sort of think about those things. Am I doing things on a day-to-day basis that are really matching with what I think is important? And if you're not, then you can change. And if you are, then maybe you won't be quite so bored.
I feel like some people might confuse boredom with like depression or not being able to start or have a drive
Yeah.
to do something. Can you tell us the difference possibly between boredom and depression?
So we've known since the earliest days of any psychological research on boredom that there's a strong relationship between boredom and depression. People who are depressed tend to be bored a lot as well, and vice
Hmm.
versa. The problem, of course, is this is a chicken and egg sort of thing. What
Yeah.
comes first? Does a person sort of find themselves chronically bored and then get depressed because of it? Or does it happen the other way around? And at the moment, we don't really know what the answer is to that. The way I like to think about it as a distinction to understand the difference between the two is that I think that both states, being depressed and being bored, represent a kind of disengagement from the world around you. But you kind of place the blame at that in different ways. And so a person who's chronically bored seems to think that the world is not enough, that the things that are external to them are not satisfying. But the person who's depressed tends to turn inward, and they think that they are not enough. And those ruminating thoughts of the depressed person that tend to be very self-critical. They're both a disengagement, but one of them's turned outward and the other one's turned inward.
Do you see, how about like with physiologic injury to the brain, for example, traumatic brain injury or stroke and stuff like that? Do you see sometimes the various type of injury? I guess this kind of goes back to, trying to identify where this is coming from, but are you seeing, any relationship between those kinds of injuries and increase or decrease in boredom?
This is one of the things that got me into boredom research in the first instance, and particularly working with people who'd had traumatic brain injuries. And here I'm talking about acceleration, deceleration injuries, motor vehicle crashes, concussions, falls, these kinds of things. And as you would know, Buck, one of the more prominent areas of the brain that's affected in these TBIs is the orbitofrontal cortex. This is part of your brain just above your eyes. And that part of the brain is critical for representing value and reward. And when you talk about dopamine hits, that, not to get too much jargon heavy in your listeners, but the ventral striatum projects that dopamine to the orbitofrontal cortex to represent value, represent reward. And we have shown, and others have shown, that people who've had these kind of traumatic brain injuries that affect that part of the brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, do tend to report higher levels of boredom proneness. To me, that suggests, and there's a lot more to do about that, but it suggests to me that their threshold for what counts as engaging, pleasurable fun has been reset by their injury. And now they have to try and breach a higher threshold, a more challenging threshold. And that's why they find themselves bored post-injury. But yeah, there's absolutely that link.
Interesting at the same time, sorry to interrupt, but it's interesting at the same time because it seems like a lot of those frontal injury types like end up being irrationally happier at the same time. And so it's kind of curious that boredom levels go up. And I don't know if the happiness is something that I just observed or if that's, an actual something that's documented, but.
Yeah, as far as I know, and again, as you would know too, one of the things about working with humans that have had damage to their brain, the damage is typically highly variable, typically large, and so it encompasses lots of different parts of the brain. When we say something like orbitofrontal cortex, it's actually a very large area, and within that large area, there's subsections that do different things. My own personal experience about that irrational happiness or sort of indifference to the challenges of their injury, I saw a couple of patients who had, again, this is too much jargon for your listeners, but
No, it's
anterior,
not.
No, it's not. You're fine.
So anterior communicating artery aneurysms, and these are sort of affecting that much more medial portion of the frontal cortex. And for them, they were kind of indifferent. And I don't know, I'd have to go back and look at the research to see whether or not that's more than just a perception of mine.
Just to drill down on that, it could sort of make sense. Like what I'm perceiving maybe is irrational happiness is indifference. Indifference is similar to boredom. So what I'm kind of talking about is people who've got this really bad prognosis who all of a sudden don't seem to, be bothered by it too much. So maybe that's more akin to boredom than it is irrational happiness. So.
Yeah, maybe. Like I say, there's a lot more to do on this. And one of the things in a very crude sort of way, I'd be very interested to know what the different effects of right versus left frontal damage would be too. Because as we know, like the right frontal cortex is very important for sort of novelty seeking and processing novel stimuli and events. So maybe damage to that would make you less bored because you don't have that need anymore for novel experiences. But I don't have any data on that.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's bring it back to what we see, a lot of people see who are listening to this show. For example, I have a 9-year-old daughter who just simply could not possibly be bored. I mean, she is constantly moving, and then the thing about it is it kind of reminds me of myself back at that age, but suddenly I became this little crusty guy who gets bored frequently. So what happens as we age? Presumably it's probably, you can tell me the research says, but younger people probably are less prone to boredom than people who are older and probably seniors as well.
Yeah, well, so we need to do a lot more work on that, particularly with young children. So, you might have had your daughter tell you when she was much younger that she was bored or something. And when a 4-year-old says that to you, do we know that they're using the word in the same way that we do? It's kind of hard to tell with a 4-year-old's brain. And I think for that reason, we haven't got as much work on boredom in very young children as we'd really need. But what the data shows is that boredom starts to kind of increase in the tween to early teenage years. And this is a really interesting period of development because the teenager, the 12, 13, 14-year-old, is starting to gain high-level sophisticated cognitive skills, right? But their world is still constrained. And we are constraining it mostly. They're constrained by the rules of school and their
Wow.
parental constructions. So as they gain these new skills and want this new independence, they're not allowed to exert it. And so they can start to show these higher levels of boredom. And then it continues to increase in those teenage years and it starts to drop off at the late teens and early 20s. And as you would know, this is the part of development where the last stages of brain maturation come online. And is that part of the brain, the frontal part, that is coming online in the late teens, early 20s. So it makes sense that as you get these abilities for self-control, self-regulation, and they start to hit those adult levels in the early 20s, that you'd experience boredom a little bit less. So then we see that boredom drops during the middle decades, your 30s and 40s, and most of us will say, yeah, I've got a career to pursue, I've got a mortgage to pay, I've got kids to raise, I've got stuff to do, who's got time to be bored in those middle years? And then it starts to raise again in the 60s and 70s and beyond. But I think at that point, it's for slightly different sort of reasons. So one of them is loneliness. So the better your social network, and I don't mean online social network, but the better your social network, the less bored you'll be in your 60s and 70s. And another one that's fascinating, it comes from my colleague Mark Fensky, is about sensory loss. So people who have hearing loss in their 60s and 70s and beyond tend to be more bored.
They
And
feel
that to
lonely
me
too.
and is exactly
Because they're
that, Nikki.
disconnected.
Exactly. They disconnect from those social connections that you would normally have because they can't converse, because they can't hear it. And so now they're more bored. And so that does tend to happen.
I feel like that leads a lot to depression because I've had that when my grandma, she, her hearing was going away and she would just kind of go inward, especially with her generation. They're not encouraged to actually talk out their feelings or anything. It's more of like, I don't want to be a burden. And then they can't hear on top of it. So they just go inward. And I feel like they get really like depressed to that point.
Yeah, absolutely.
One other thing just on the age thing, that whole thing is kind of dynamic too, because I remember when I was a kid, when I was 9 or 10 years old and we'd go on a road trip, I didn't have like an iPad to play with. And I, like now I feel like I don't think I would ever be bored. I mean, like now, I hate to say it, but whenever I'm bored, I just pick up my phone and start fiddling, which is a terrible habit, I know. But how does the digital world play into all of this?
Yeah, I get a little bit
I think it's negative.
I
Yeah,
get
I'm
a little
sure.
bit wary of jumping on that bandwagon of saying, internet bad, social media bad, it's ruining your brain. Because we've always worried about new technologies. We worried about writing. Socrates thought writing was going to ruin our memory capacity because writing things
Really?
down meant that you didn't have to remember them. The irony, of course, is that we only know about that because Plato wrote it down. But,
Yeah.
so we worry about all of these new technologies. And certainly when the internet became widespread in the mid-90s, it wasn't long before we started to talk about internet addiction. And so my caveat to all of that is to say, without the internet, without social, you and I aren't talking right now, and we aren't sharing these stories with your listeners. And I think the internet and social media does wonderful things for us. Having said that, there's some data coming out, John Elhigh at University of Toledo and a lot of other sort of labs looking at what we call problematic smartphone use. And so this is about 4 to 8% of people, depending on which study you look at, who show behaviors with respect to their smartphone that are very much addiction-like. So they use their phones more and more as time goes on. So they can't be without their phone. And when they are without their phone, they feel quite anxious. And so those two behaviors that characterize problematic smartphone use are very much the kinds of things that you'd associate with addictive behaviors. And it turns out that boredom is a pretty prominent driver of that problematic smartphone use. The distinction I'd sort of make is that turning to your phone when there's some downtime is not a bad thing. Like if you're having to wait in line at the dreaded DMV, then, pull out your phone and do a Wordle, whatever. That's fine. If you're turning to your phone without thinking and it becomes something you're turning to over and
Out
over
of
and over and
habit.
over again, making a habit out of it,
Mhm.
then perhaps it's not going to be such a good thing, because ultimately it's a passive way of occupying your mind.
Mhm.
And what you want to do, what boredom is pushing you to do, is actively use your mind and actively engage with the world around you.
Yeah. Well, you kind of lose the skill of going inward. You lose the skill of also knowing how to just be with yourself and just being.
Yeah, I think that's true too. And I think there's a lot of value in being able to do that, to, sit in that room for 15 minutes with just your thoughts without administering an electric shock. It's probably a good
Right.
idea.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's a relationship between like people who get bored and their overall health level or longevity, since this is a
There's this
longevity
really great
podcast?
study from Britton and Shipley, I think in 2011, and they looked at data from British civil servants. And they had this data from the 1970s right up until the 2000s, I think. And they were able to look at how bored you were in your job and then death rates, right? So, and what you died from. And so this is not a causal thing. This is things that epidemiologists will do. But they showed that people who reported being more bored at their work were more likely to have died from heart disease 30 years later. And that kind of suggests that, yeah, boredom is probably not great for your health. We have shown that when you make people bored, that they can have an increase in cortisol levels, and chronic increase in cortisol is not good for your health, right? So, yeah, I think that there is some evidence. It's probably not overwhelming, but there's some evidence that, yeah, boredom is not good for your physical health, and we certainly know it's not good for your mental health.
Well, just to add on to the hearing issue you talked about, we know that there's a very, very clear link between hearing loss and Alzheimer's disease and dementia.
All right.
In fact, it's a really interesting. You should look this study up. I can't remember what that is, but in the elderly, when you actually restore their hearing with a hearing aid, their risk of dementia goes back to baseline. So it is a real significant.
I wonder too
issue.
whether or not that finding also comes back to social connection, right? So you restore the hearing, they connect better with people, and that works out the brain better, and so it staves off the disease.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just the ability of constantly interfacing with the world, and when you stop doing that, you lose it. Use it or lose it type thing. So,
And we have found that social connections is definitely connected with longevity, like in happiness and purpose and connection. So definitely.
It's kind of one of those duh results, right? And it's like, of course
Yeah,
it does, right? Of course it's
of
important
course.
for all that sort of stuff.
Right, exactly. Very true.
I feel like we should shift into more just, well, we still have you. Like, okay, what are some more practical things that you can do? If you do tend to have those feelings of boredom frequently, I know it's just like, it's easy to just kind of be like, well, don't be bored. There's only boring people, which is what, my kids, their mom tells them that all the time. And, but how do you get out of the hole?
Yeah, the telling people just don't be bored is kind of like telling a drowning person just swim. Just
Right.
swim to shore. Like, if they could, they would, right? And
Yeah,
so,
right.
of
Right.
course, we don't do that. I said the three things before. Try and take a deep breath. Think about why you're bored right now. Think about what matters to you. Those things I think are important. But proactively, I've often talked to parents about sitting down with their children and thinking of a list of things that will work for you when you're bored next time. And so, trying to solve the problem not while you're in the throes of a boring episode, right? Because I think it's hard to do at that time. And that might just work for the rest of us as well, right? So sitting down and saying, here's a list of things that I know typically work. I mentioned before that I'll often turn to my guitar, but I said it only works 80% of the time, right? So it's not a fail-safe, and nothing ever is likely to be as fail-safe. You're going to want 4 or 5 things, 4 or 5 outlets that you can turn to easily and quickly to say, all right, now I'm not bored anymore. My wife is a little bit like you, I think, Nikki. She says she's never bored because there's always something to do, right? And so she doesn't understand me that well. She sort of said, why do you get bored? I mean, and she's that classic sort of thing that a mother would say too. It's like, if you're bored, I got something for you to do, right?
Right.
But so, for some people, it's not really a problem. But for those who are a bit more like me, then, yeah, proactively writing some sort of list that tells you this is what I can turn to when I feel the signal of boredom coming on.
I I feel like if someone told me, okay, do some research on boredom, then I feel like that'd be a pretty quick research for me personally. And you've been researching this for a really long time. So how do you stay interested in boredom? How do you not get bored out of the boredom?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, partly that's just a question about science, Nikki. So, like, whenever you do any sort of experiment, you never get a full answer, and so
Yeah.
there's always more questions. There's always more to understand, more to know, and then part of it also comes back to social connection too, right? The
Mhm.
work that I do doesn't actually get done by me; it gets done by my graduate students, and so
Mm.
interacting with them and hearing their ideas and bouncing ideas back and forward from them always keeps you fresh and keeps you interested in what you're doing.
Yeah, soundboarding is really fun and it's really awesome to hear other people's opinions. But you were saying that there's always questions.
Mm-hmm.
It was like what questions?
Well, we still don't know enough about what is happening in the brain when people are bored. We need to sort of know a little bit more about the dynamics of that. Is it something that you sort of are triggered into the state and then you're sunk in it, or is it something that you fluctuate in and out of over time?
Mm.
And do people fluctuate differently? Are your fluctuations wilder than mine because of boredom proneness? So there's lots to know about the dynamics of
Mhm.
boredom. We want to know more about how boredom is kind of represented in the body. How do you feel it? Because every emotion is felt as an embodied experience. You
Mhm.
feel you feel happiness in your chest or something. You feel the anger might be sort of a flushing of the face and something else happening in your hands. So what about boredom? Where is that felt in the body? So there's questions like that we want to know, and then ultimately, because you guys have already asked me about it, and
Mm.
I told you we haven't done it, is these intervention studies. What's going to work? What's the best way to develop to help people get out of boredom episodes? And so that work is still ahead of us as well.
Are there gender differences when it comes to experiencing boredom?
I used to say yes to that question because
Mm.
there was some research that would say that men were a little bit more bored or boredom prone than women.
Mm. Mm.
It's highly variable, and the difference is really tiny. So sometimes in some of our samples, women are more bored. Sometimes it's men, and it's the difference is just not that dramatic. And that I think that plays into this notion that this is a function that we've evolved to have, right? But it would
Mm.
be funny if only men were evolved to be bored, right?
Right. What about different cultures? Do they experience or interpret boredom differently?
Yeah, so we just did a study. We haven't quite published it yet, where we took a sample from China, from the United Arab Emirates, and from Canada to answer that exact question. And
Mm.
there were some very small sort of differences, but in general, boredom and its relationship to other factors like self control and agency was consistent across all three cultures. And so consistent both in direction of relationships and the strength of those relationships. And so while I think maybe boredom might express itself differently across different cultures, I think it's felt the same. And so we're on the cusp of trying to publish that work now.
Yeah, back into that feeling you were talking about.
Hmm.
Well, this has been really interesting. Thank you so much for, giving us all this great information. How can we learn more about, your research and all the interesting things that we've talked about today?
Well, you can certainly find a lot of it just on my website, which is just my name or lowercase, so jamesdanckert.com. And that will also point you to a Google Scholar page. But if you want to dive really deep into the scientific papers, then most nowadays we make them open access so that anybody can get a handle of them. And then there's some plenty of books out now that Nikki mentioned ours at the start, the Out of My Skull that I
Right.
wrote with
Out of
John
my
Eastwood.
skull. Right.
Yeah,
Which is a
and there's
great
a
title, by the way,
Yeah.
because I feel like I used to hear my
Out
my
of my
grandma or
mind.
something yeah, saying like, I'm,
Yeah.
like, bored out of my mind or whatever.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. No, it's
yeah.
great.
Yeah, so those are good places to go if you want more information.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Awesome. Well,
Well,
thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, you as well. All right, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back with our healthy takeout.
Longevity Junky is grateful to our partners at BioAccelerator for a very memorable trip and experience.
Agreed. Buck and I both benefited greatly from this incredible stem cell therapy, which can play a huge role in longevity.
You may know BioAccelerator is one of the leading stem cell research laboratories in the world, delivering advanced therapies directed at anything from anti-aging, pain relief, skin rejuvenation, and even preventive care.
It is truly inspiring work that can help each and every one of us. And if you want to learn more, please reach out to Liz at Longevity Junky at bioaccelerator.com for special discounts and offers. That's Longevity Junky, spelled with a Y, at BioAccelerator.com for special discounts and offers. Welcome back to Longevity Junky. It's time for our healthy takeout.
Wow.
I'm just glad that wasn't too boring.
No, I thought it
wasn't boring.
It wasn't boring. It was interesting. And in fact, I kind of feel like, I don't know, I just feel like a flawed human being because I'm sitting there thinking to myself, God, I get bored a lot. And I think I am sort of the model of everything he's talking about, like people doing, stuff. I mean,
like having all these things they could do, but not doing
like
it
when
when
I
they're
get
bored.
bored and it's usually in the evening, right? Like, because I'll be working all day long. I'll be writing, whatever. I can just cross things off my list, but then I'll eat. I think what I'm doing is it is a stimulation thing. I'm trying to get some kind of stimulation, right? Like I eat, I always like to have a cocktail in the evening, which I haven't had as much lately because of all this damn health talk we do.
It's rubbing off on you.
That
You feel
is
guilty.
Yeah, it's very much a stimulation thing, right? It's like,
Yeah.
I just need to get one of those machines that shocks you and just sit around and
just
shock
to
myself
see how
all the
many you
time.
can do in 15
Yeah.
minutes. That's really funny. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's funny when he said, "Oh, make a list of things that you can do when you're bored." I have literally done that. I actually have
Yeah.
my list over here, not like it's not far from me. And I read it the other day, and it's like basically an I can list where I write down like all the things that I can be doing in case.
Mhm.
And it's like, remember, you signed up for this class. Like, please
Yeah.
go back and do it. So I definitely have little reminders everywhere of things that I can do if I get bored, but I feel like I'm always I don't know. I don't feel like I really get bored too much. However, I think that that's a detriment to me, which is kind of weird
No,
to say.
no.
No, but I really do because I have found so much like I don't know, my therapist is like, "Well, when you go into your default mode network, like that's really good for you. That's where you'll actually find like what's important to you or where your desires live and what really is going to light you up." And I'm like, "Well, shit, I never even get there." Or at least I don't feel that I get there. And so I think for me, being as I like to go inward and meditation, and I feel like I'll get more answers going inward rather than having these exterior stimulators. I feel like it's a detriment to me personally in my
Yeah. Yeah.
I wish I got bored more just so that I can see what truly lights me up or that I really want to do instead of kind of being maybe in this like, hey, got to do this and hey, got to do that.
Yeah.
And
It
it
can be
keeps you in the same
motivational.
life.
It can be
Yeah.
motivational. Like if you're bored, ironically for me, like sometimes if I get bored, that's when I'm like, all right, I gotta do something.
Mhm.
And then, I'll write something down and okay, I'm gonna start doing this and make a list like he was talking about and really start doing it. Our producer, Phil, has experienced that, I think, on numerous occasions when all of a sudden I'm like, all right, give me a list of all the things that we need to do. And, yeah, like I have to put that list together and start, crossing things off and that kind of so it can be a springboard, I guess. But
No,
anyway,
totally. I think that's
yeah,
what he was saying or
yeah,
even some of the lectures that I've heard him speaking on this, like
yeah,
I think it is definitely a springboard on the things of what really lights you up and where your desires lie. So if you are bored, it's okay to be bored. It's really
it's
something that
okay.
has, I think, a bit more of a beneficial, like, I don't know, it's more of a beneficial feeling than something where we should be upset about it, you know?
Yeah,
And actually, I wish I wish they got bored a little bit more, just enough to, like, light them up to go outside and play or do something more active as opposed to just, like, picking up the phone because it's becoming
yeah,
literally out of habit. Like, even for me, and I'm sure maybe even you, I don't know, but for me,
yeah,
like, out of habit, if I'm not doing something, I pick up my phone to just turn it on or just to pick it up. And it's like, and I catch myself doing that and I'm like, I don't need to pick you up. Like, what the hell? But
Yeah.
imagine these, like, 6-year-olds, 7-year-olds, that's what they're getting trained to do, that as soon as they don't have anything like stimulating them in their environment, then they're just straight going to this thing and they just scroll. And I've asked recently these kids, like, "Hey, like, what are you doing on your phone?" "Oh, nothing." Well, but if you're doing nothing, I don't know, I'm just bored.
Yeah.
I'm just scrolling.
No,
And
that
I'm
brings
like,
an entirely different world up. We probably need to have a completely different show on the whole internet thing and all that scrolling and all that business.
I
But
don't think that's really healthy for us at all,
yeah.
actually. It might be
Anyway,
stimulating if you do something productive on it, but I think just like there's gotta be parts of our brain that, because we just rely on scrolling or we rely on our phones, that there has to be atrophy somewhere,
sure,
you know? And
sure.
I don't know, it drives me nuts. So I'm gonna stop right there.
Anyway, it was a fun show. It's always kind of fun to do these topics that are kind of a little tangential, but at the same time, very, things that we think about.
Or experience
Yeah,
daily.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
you want to read us out?
Sure. Longevity Junky is created by Dr. Buck Joffrey, MD. It's executive produced by myself, Nikki Lee, Dr. Buck Joffrey, and Phil Ferragamo, and we're distributed by our friends at Acast. See you next time.